And we are very lucky to have with us live in the studios this morning, David Goodman. David Goodman is an award-winning independent journalist. He is a contributing writer to Mother Jones. His articles have also appeared in numerous publications, including The Washington Post, The Los Angeles Times, Outside, and The Nation magazine. He is also the author of 7 books, including Fault Lines, Journeys into the New South Africa, The Exception to the Rulers, Oily Politicians, War Profiteers, and the Media That Love Them, co-authored with Amy Goodman. Static, Government Liars, Media Cheerleaders, and the People Who Fight Back, also co-authored with Amy Goodman. And he is here to talk about his new book, Standing Up to the Madness, Ordinary Heroes in Extraordinary Times, also authored with Amy Goodman. If you could begin, tell us what was the motivation in writing your new book, Standing Up to the Madness?
Well, as you just mentioned, this is the 3rd book for my sister, Amy Goodman, who's host of the daily show Democracy Now! So it's our 3rd book together. And in the course of the previous 2 books, Exception to the Rulers and Static, we do these very ambitious, sleep-deprived national book tours. And those tours aren't just us, going around and flogging these books. It's also a chance to take the pulse of what's happening in communities everywhere we speak. And we speak in rural areas, urban areas, really all over the place. It's one of the both exhausting and exhilarating parts of these tours is how much ground we cover. In the course of these trips, we are meeting people who are telling us about things that they are doing in their communities and, really very often very unlikely, improbable kind of local heroes. These are also the kind of people who Amy is interviewing every day on Democracy Now! And so it felt as we now are approaching a new presidential season. We will have a new president in January, that this was the perfect time to take a look at what we really feel is the hidden hand behind politics in America, and that is the grassroots movers and movements who have taken politics out of the hands of politicians and are really driving the direction of our country today. To give you an idea of some of these people who we profile in Standing Up to the Madness, we visited New Orleans. We spent a good part of last year just traveling to different places and profiling and meeting and observing for ourselves the work that's going on. So in New Orleans, African-American community activists have taken it upon themselves now. I mean, the full realization now of what has happened in New Orleans is now settling in for many people there, which is that they have been abandoned by the federal government and by state and local governments. And this may come as a bit of a surprise. One is always hearing about these big efforts and money that's pouring in there. But in fact, in the poorest communities, in the public housing projects, for example, those people have been pushed out and shut out, and, a very kind of diabolical thing has come to pass, and it's actually come to pass just this week, in that New Orleans had 5 major public housing projects that housed about 5,000 people. Many of those public housing projects were not flooded. They were on high ground. And yet, the Katrina was an opportunity for the feds, the city and state, to essentially change the demographics of New Orleans and make it a wealthier, whiter city. It is a majority black city, was before Katrina. And so they announced that the 5 housing projects would be knocked down and replaced with mixed-income housing. And the news hook, this week is that one of the biggest, which was not flooded, called the Lafitte Housing Project, demolition began this week over furious protests by, we're talking about, these are people who are really struggling, the people in these public housing projects. So the end result of this plan is that the homeless population of New Orleans has doubled within the last few months, not surprisingly. So we went to look at people who are taking a stand and recognizing that no help is coming, are building brick by brick, corner by corner, rebuilding the lower 9th Ward, the area that was most devastated by the flood. That's just one community. And it's a story really of kind of redemption in the middle of this. It gives us an opportunity to talk about what has happened in New Orleans, but also to look at where some flicker of hope is in this, because I can tell you it has been hard to find hope in that environment. It's fine if you want to look at the French Quarter or some famous tourist destination. You'll see rebuilding and all kinds of signs of revitalization. But the trick is, and the reason it's been hidden from view, is that the poorest people are always hidden from view. They have been marginalized in the corporate media, and it's not where people are going. So that's where we aimed our lenses and microphones and pens. Some of the other unlikely heroes, and I think of this group as maybe our most improbable heroes, you might be surprised to hear that there are only 4 people in America who have stood up to the FBI and the Patriot Act and won and defeated one of the most draconian provisions of the Patriot Act, a provision called a national security letter, which allows an FBI agent to show up at your door without a judge's order and declare he is going to launch an investigation into anything he likes about you, and you cannot tell anybody about it. So who stood up and fought them off? 4 librarians in Connecticut. And the story, we call it Librarians Unbound. Of these librarians, it turns out that the FBI came and they wanted information about somebody who had sent an email on a particular day, an email that they thought was suspicious. The computer system served 27 libraries around Hartford, Connecticut, so there was no way that one library could figure this out. So the FBI demanded of all 27 libraries all their information on the patrons and who had coming in, who'd been using the computers. Well, it turns out that for librarians, the privacy of their patrons is something they consider to be a sacred trust. And you would not know that mild-mannered guy with the little, librarian badge over behind the counter has the fight in him that these guys had. But it was remarkable what they went through. When the FBI showed up, they said, no, we're not giving you that. And they fought. They were all gagged in a metaphorical sense, of course, we're speaking, although at times it almost sounded as if, there were times. It is so secretive, the provisions of the Patriot Act. They were not even allowed to show their face in the courtroom where they were plaintiffs. So they filed a lawsuit against the federal government, which was handled by the National Office of the ACLU, because no lawyers are even qualified to take on these NSL, National Security Letter cases, because it's so restrictive, the national security requirements around them. So they fought and they fought and they fought, and it was theater. They would have to go in not together, these librarians, to the courthouse. No one could know they were together. They were told not to look at their lawyers, so it was not obvious who the plaintiffs were that were suing the government. But a remarkable thing happened in these courtrooms as these cases, which is that while word had gotten out that librarians were in the dock in Connecticut and were fighting, and so while it wasn't known who, each time the courtrooms, and in one court case, these librarians were considered such a threat to national security, of course, the real thing is they were an embarrassment to the government, that they were kept in a locked storage room in a federal courthouse watching by closed-circuit TV. I mean, they were being treated as first-class, terrorists. You'd think it was the librarians who brought down the World Trade Center. But what they could see on that closed-circuit TV is that the courtroom was filled with librarians from all over New York and Connecticut. And the next appearance they had to go in federal court in Manhattan, once again filled with librarians, simultaneous with the court case, a protest by librarians on the steps of the Capitol in Washington, and they were wearing gags to demonstrate what had been going on. And here's what was actually going on. What was actually going on was that the Patriot Act, this was 2005 and 2006, the Patriot Act was being debated. It was up for reauthorization in Congress. And their case illustrated the full folly of the Patriot Act in that it was going in with taking innocent people criminalizing their activities, demanding records that the government ordinarily has no right to. And librarians had exposed this. They were your worst nightmare as a prosecutor of who you could be prosecuting, because they are a symbol to all of us of these people who pose no threat and, in fact, are helping us in our communities. So the Bush administration didn't want these librarians telling Congress about the excesses of the Patriot Act. And the librarians understood this perfectly. And they were demanding, begging to be ungagged so that they could speak even to their own representatives in Congress, their senators and congresspeople, hear the voices of the victims. Anyway, the Patriot Act was reauthorized in early 2006, and their court fight, which they had been winning, well, I wouldn't say winning. There were setbacks and victories, little, one step forward, half step back. The government dropped its case 6 weeks after the Patriot Act was reauthorized. And as one of the librarians told us in this chapter in our book, it was like calling the fire department after the house is burned down. The government knew, the Bush administration knew exactly what it was doing. They were no longer a threat. And of course, the real threat was not to national security, but to the Bush administration's hold on political power.
Talk a bit, if you would, about the American Psychological Association and a woman, Jean Marie Arrigo.
Yes. Among the unlikely heroes who we write about are psychologists who became... Jean Marie Arrigo is a psychologist from Southern California. She was asked to be on a special panel of the American Psychological Association, which is it is the largest organization of psychologists in the world, about 150,000 members. The panel she was asked to be on was looking at the role of psychologists in military national security interrogations. The panel had been convened because a tremendous controversy had started to brew among psychologists when word was getting out that psychologists were playing key roles in the torture that was going on at Guantanamo Bay and at other CIA so-called black sites. These are secret prisons where the CIA operates around the world. So when this became public knowledge, and it wasn't just psychologists, it was the role of healers generally, doctors, psychiatrists, psychologists. As word of this came out, the two other leading associations of healthcare providers, the American Medical Association and the American Psychiatric Association, both issued orders barring their members from participating in these abusive interrogations and basically pulling them out completely from Guantanamo Bay, the argument being that in a place where people are deprived of basic civil liberties, of access to attorneys and this kind of thing, it is fundamentally an environment of abuse. You can't fine-tune that abuse and say, well, a doctor is a good guy, but the place is a bad place. They just looked at the whole scene and said, we're not going to enable this place to operate. Psychologists and the American Psychological Association strangely refused to pull their members out. And the panel that Jean Marie Arrigo was on instead issued what many psychologists consider to be a whitewash, saying psychologists played a very important role. The role that they were playing, as one of the leading psychologists, Dr. Stephen Reisner, a psychoanalyst from New York City, told us in our book, the real role that they were playing, as he said, was we were the last ones willing to do the dirty work of the government in places like Guantanamo. And so Jean Marie Arrigo leaked all the information that she had as a member of this high-level commission. It turns out that this commission, convened by the APA, was in fact more than half the members worked in or with the military and the CIA. So they had created a panel that from the beginning, these people, their own jobs, not to mention the question that has been raised repeatedly, whether these people might be liable for war crimes prosecutions. The very people who were potentially subject to these kinds of prosecutions were in fact passing judgment on themselves. A classic stacked deck. So Jean Marie Rico leaks all this information about what's going on in Guantanamo. Other psychologists take up the call, and we attended last summer the national convention of the APA, which was held in San Francisco, at which there was such an uproar over the issue of the APA's refusal to bar psychologists that they had a whole mini convention within their convention on torture and interrogations and this kind of thing. And they were trotting out the APA was trotting out lots of high-level military people. It was quite bizarre to be at a convention of psychologists and seeing guys in camo and navy whites strutting around alongside you. But in fact, quite a few psychologists work in the military. However, I mean, out of an organization of 150,000, it's a very small number. But they had a very big presence there. And out of this, each year, under pressure, the APA has been incrementally tightening its restrictions. So while they don't have to now be pulled out of it, they can't participate in a range of activities from waterboarding to sexual humiliation, and they sort of itemized the tortures. But the fundamental question, should they be there at all, which physicians, doctors, had ultimately decided no, they should not. The psychologists have refused to take that step. So there has been an uprising now among psychologists who are fighting back, calling for an end to torture. And now running for president of the APA is one of the leaders, this fellow, Dr. Steve Reisner, is running to be president. They just had nominations this week. He received the highest number of votes in nomination. Now, I mean, I should say this is not going to be a walkthrough for him. It's not like there's this hidden, majority that's ready to put him in. I mean, these organizations are very tightly run. The current leadership is choosing its own candidate and putting her forward. So the point is simply it is yet another area where we least expect it. People who work 50 minutes per hour and have a very certain drill. And yet these are the folks who they too are fighting back. So across the board, the whole range of crackdowns that has occurred on civil liberties, the essentially making torture a national policy of our government, the invasions of privacy. We're seeing resistance and grassroots mobilization in every corner, and psychologists among them. So, these are yet more of the stories we talk about.
As well as a incident involving a T-shirt in an airport sparked something major, too.
T is for terrorist. That's what we learned. We have a whole chapter on the T-shirt terrorists who are threatening to overturn 200 and some years of constitutional government in the United States, or at least that's what we would be led to believe. One of the main people we profile on T is for terrorist is a fellow by the name of Raed Gerard. He is an Iraqi-born American citizen who had the bad sense to show up at an airport, in Kennedy Airport in New York, to fly, wearing a T-shirt that said, "We shall not be silent" on it. And it said it in English, and it said it in Arabic. This phrase, "we shall not be silent," which is also the title of the introduction to our book, Standing Up to the Madness, actually comes from a resistance group in Nazi Germany called the White Rose. The White Rose was led by a brother and sister, Hans and Sophie Scholl, and a philosophy professor, and included a number of other students. They were in Nazi Germany, where the press was government controlled, all dissent was being stamped out by the Nazis. They looked around at what was going on, were horrified, and felt the need to bypass the conventional methods that people were getting information, which were so heavily censored, and get out their own version of it. And they issued these leaflets all around Germany. One of them, one of the last ones before they were caught by the Gestapo, had this phrase on it: "We shall not be silent. We are your guilty conscience." They were eventually caught and tried and beheaded, the White Rose, but they are considered heroes in Germany as people who stood up. But it was also a form of community media. It was a It was a grassroots kind of media operation. But you asked about T-shirts. So this is the T-shirt that he's wearing. He's stopped as he's about to board a JetBlue flight and is told, you can't wear that T-shirt. He asks, why not? He says, well, it says something in Arabic on it. And he said, and is Arabic a banned language? Well, people are made uncomfortable by it. And so he's surrounded by these security officials who then demand that he put on another T-shirt. Then one runs over and buys him a T-shirt, and they're debating. We have in here the account of the debate between the officials. One is saying, maybe get him in one of those I Love New York shirts, and they saying, no, that would take him to the other extreme. And he was saying, why would you think I don't love New York? Because I have an Arabic script on my... and they're saying, well, we don't know that that's what it says in Arabic and all this. So in the end, they force him to put on a T-shirt. He does want to fly home. He's flying to San Francisco, and he's forced to put this on. His ticket is ripped up. He was sitting in the front of the plane, and they send him to the back of the bus or the plane to sit. And it turns out that his story, and then his cause is taken up from there. He gets interviewed on Democracy Now! The story goes out, and all of a sudden, a group in New York called Artists Against the War, who actually had made his T-shirt and given one of the people, Laurie Arbeiter, had given him this T-shirt at a rally. He didn't know them, but he thought it was an interesting shirt. And they show up at Kennedy Airport flying to take board flights going all over the place. And they are then able to, it's their challenge. Another woman is stopped on a ferry in New York City, the Staten Island Ferry, who's wearing a We Shall Not Be Silent T-shirt. She's surrounded by armed Coast Guardsmen. And we tell other stories, people who were arrested in West Virginia wearing a T-shirt where President Bush was speaking, and it had Bush's name with a red circle and a slash, the international band symbol. They were arrested, sued, and won not only some money, but they got access to the White House advance manual on wherever President Bush showed, where it was revealed that the White House organizes to have protesters pushed out of the camera shot wherever Bush will be speaking, so they're not visible on TV. And they have rally squads where they advise people wherever they see protesters to show up with placards and shout things, and they have suggestions. USA, USA is one of them. So these so-called counter-demonstrations you see are not spontaneous. They are, in fact, well organized by the White House, part of this whitewashing of images that has been going on now throughout the entire Bush administration, where they have understood intimately that controlling the message, controlling the image, is crucial to controlling people. So T-shirt terrorists have been popping up all over the place. We talk about a vet who's wearing a Veterans for Peace T-shirt who's arrested in Chicago, a kid in Vermont who ends up being kicked out of school for wearing a T-shirt criticizing Bush. His case goes to the Supreme Court, and he wins. This is what is going on, where the idea of uncontrolled information getting out or uncontrolled images are in fact what is really perceived as the biggest threat. And there has been a huge pushback. Back to the beginning, though, this Raed Jarrar, Raed has sued the government over this restraint of his First Amendment. But I did also ask him, so why did you wear that T-shirt to the airport? And he said, I didn't even know that that's what was on my T-shirt. He said, the reason I wore that T-shirt that day is because it's the only one I had that was clean.
I saw in your book you even included the mention of here in Seattle when the federal government, released info about two potentially questionable people on a Washington State ferry, and some of the media picked that up and some of it didn't.
It was an incredible story, but one that is pretty much par for the course. This business of racial profiling, which really is at the heart of the Raed Jarrar story. He's an olive-skinned man but trying to board a plane. That's really what was the big problem here. And you had it here in Seattle, where last summer the FBI releases a photo of two olive-skinned young men on a ferry. And asks local media to run these photos. Seattle Times runs it, plasters it all over the city. Local TV stations run it. The Seattle Post-Intelligencer chooses not to run the photos for one simple reason. Why are these men, why have they been singled out? They could be Latino, they could be Italian, they could be Middle Eastern. But the real message that the FBI knew it could run with, the real story, was that they looked sufficiently Middle Eastern, and then they were allowing the public to fill in all the other fears and details and racist kind of imagery that could go along with that. They said that the men were engaging in suspicious activities. They were looking around the boat. They seemed to have an undue interest. Now, of course, when I've ridden the ferries around here, it's hard not to look like you have an undue interest at one of the most spectacular landscapes we have in this country. You may be, for some of you, it may just be your daily commute and you don't notice it, but I can tell you, living in Vermont, when I come to Washington, it's quite spectacular to be on those ferries. So anyway, the story of these men and how they were racially profiled, plastered across the airwaves, as far as I know, and the men never were found or identified who they were. And the story of one paper taking what I think is the right and courageous stand, which is refusing to go along with this kind of racist profiling of these people, is indicative of what's been going on, at a national level and a local level.
Only a couple minutes left. So these are both horrifying stories that you bring out in the book, but also inspiring for what all these people are doing and succeeding in.
I hope it's inspiring. I'm inspired by a lot of these people who we met, the psychologists, the librarians, the T-shirt wearers, the environmental the government scientists who have fought back against censorship is another chapter we have. Students in Connecticut whose student play, which consisted of reading the letters home from Iraq War soldiers, they were banned in their high school and landed on a national stage in New York City, where the Public Theater in New York and Culture Project both offered them to perform it in the city. In Gina, Louisiana, where we went, where the 6 young men who were charged with murder for a schoolyard fight, and they fought back. And finally, soldiers of conscience, one of whom lives right here around Seattle, Aaron Wattada, first officer to refuse to fight in what he says is an illegal war. I find a lot of hope in these stories, and I think that America should find a lot of hope in these stories, because it is their spirit of grassroots resistance, I think, that has really, they have come to the defense of our democracy when leaders wouldn't lead. Basically, when leaders have abdicated leadership, it falls to ordinary citizens to pick up that fallen torch of democracy, and that's what our book, Standing Up to the Madness, really chronicles.
Well, I want to thank you very much for spending time with us this morning.
Thank you, Mike.